Story number 1. The Old Church. When I was younger, I used to live next to this very old and run-down church. This church was one of the town's original buildings from the late 1800s. It had been remodeled a few times, but mostly the building had maintained its original design. It was a large, square, white plaster-sided building with a very short bell tower capping the top of the roof. The church had gone through several owners for various reasons and had also been used for several purposes while I was growing up. When I was very young, it was basically abandoned, and kids would sometimes play in there. I never really liked being in that church. It just made me feel uncomfortable. So I would rarely go into the church, even when other kids were there. At some point, it became a night school. The teenagers that had to attend the school would say that they would see spooky things out of the corners of their eyes, or hear strange sounds when no one was talking. Very shortly after becoming a night school, they moved the school to another building. They said it was because they needed more space, but all the teens joked that it was because the teachers were frightened of the building itself. After being empty for another year or so, it was rented out to a family who turned it into their house. The family was lower middle class, just like my family, and they rented it because it was so cheap. Their living room was basically the bottom floor of the building, since the church hadn't been remodeled into a proper house. It was just being used as one. Even then, I didn't really like that church. It was directly attached to our yard, and I wouldn't get too close at night because it creeped me out that much. Despite the creepy church house, our families became fairly close in the short time that they lived there, and my mom would babysit their infant from time to time pretty often. I was around 13 at that time, and my friends were friends with the 2 other kids who lived in that church. They would tell me that they thought the church was a little creepy at night too, but nothing really interesting had happened to them. One night, my younger sister got scared of something and woke me up. She said she heard something weird outside of her window and wanted me to check it out for her. Her bedroom window is on the 2nd floor and faces the church. Now, I'm not super keen on doing this, but I feel like I have to, so I do it anyway. I get to her window and look outside. To my relief, I don't see anything of interest. No marks on the window, nothing outside in the yard, no cliched branches rubbing on the window. I begin to tell her it's fine when we both hear what sounds like a baby crying in the distance. I realize it must be the neighbor's baby and tell her not to worry about it. I just think to myself that their baby must be incredibly loud for us to hear it all the way over here. I take another look out the window to see a woman in a red dress walking by the church window, cradling what must have been the baby. I get chills down my spine and I look away quickly. I assume it was my neighbor's mom and decide that it's time to go back to bed. A few months later, it's the neighbor's turn to babysit us for my mom. My sister and I pretty much have to stay the night in this creepy church with our neighbors. The neighbor kids showed us around their house to make sure that we knew where everything was. The 2 kids' bedrooms were upstairs next to the nursery that they set up for the baby. Mom and Dad's room was downstairs because it was the biggest bedroom. The kitchen and bathroom were downstairs and attached to the living room. It was an interesting layout for the house, but it was obviously still just a church with a living room set up in the main hall. We spent most of the night watching movies and cartoons and were successfully distracted for the majority of the evening. Eventually, it was bedtime, so we rolled out our sleeping bags and went to sleep in the living room. At some point in the night, we were all woken up by the baby crying from upstairs. It was annoyingly loud. We hoped the baby would just stop on its own, but after waiting for a while, the neighbor kid decided that it was time to wake up their parents. The mom came out of their room, wondering what was wrong, and we told her that the baby was crying. She looked really confused and listened quietly for a moment, and obviously, she too heard the baby crying. She then turned around and woke up her husband and said something to him in a frightened tone. It was dark, so we couldn't see much into their bedroom, but after a moment she came out of their bedroom holding their sleeping baby. The crying continued. Her husband came out of their bedroom holding a broom like a baseball bat and tells us to all stay downstairs. We're all terrified and going into the living room to sit on the couch and waiting for him to come back. As he climbs the squeaking stairs, we can still hear the baby crying, while their baby is still fast asleep. Suddenly the crying stops. You can hear the husband walking around on the old floorboards, creaking with every step, and he yells, "Come on out or I'll call the police." No response. After a while of creaking floorboards, he comes back downstairs and shrugs his shoulders. "Probably an injured animal or something. Must have scared it away," he says. Despite that, we all spent the rest of the evening by that couch together. They moved away shortly after, and the church remained uninhabited for several years after that. A few years after the baby incident, I became friends with somebody who had moved into that house across the street from the church after they'd moved away. When I learned that he had lived across the street from where I used to live, I told him how I always hated that church. He agreed. Before I could tell him my story, he told me one of his own. He told me that he had once been getting home late when he thought he heard someone yelling in the distance. He wasn't able to make out any words, but he was sure that he heard someone yelling something from far away. So he started looking around when he spotted a woman in a red dress circling inside the bell tower of that church, walking where there used to be a floor. His story made me shudder as I remembered the woman outside my sister's window. Story number 2. A couple of small stories. Just a small collection of things that happened that were weird and spooky. Just today I was reading a story about a ghost trying to get someone's attention. They were trying to get their attention aloud to my sister and the alarm went off, set for nowhere near the time that it happened too. I heard noises underneath my bed a couple of years ago. One was an organ or a piano, and I was in the basement with no such instruments in this house. A disembodied voice that sounded like my mom calling my name while I was waiting for the bus. I woke myself up and she was sleeping. I walked into a room in the basement and saw a little Amish boy in the corner. I thought he was my sister at first, but when I looked back, he had vanished. I had a bunk bed and always had it in the couch position, with curtains around it, and was constantly just watching a shadow figure walk around and disappear or something right before it got to the one open side of the bed. Story number 3. The Lone Walker. There's reason why the phrase, "things that go bump in the night," exist. While working the night shift on the railroad, one of the sites that we were conducting repairs on happens to rest next to a graveyard. The timing couldn't be more perfect because it was the middle of October, which only added to the eerie nature of the environment. It can be said that what I saw could be chalked up to fatigue or my subconscious playing a trick on me. But that doesn't explain why the entire work crew saw the same thing. To To set the scene, my team was sent out to repair the tracks at a local station, which rest in a nice but historic area. Residing next to the station is a bike path, residential housing, and an old cemetery. Work progressed as normal. We were making great timing on the repairs. It had gotten late in the night, around 11 p.m., when we saw an older gentleman casually walking down the bike path. He was pale, wearing a tan button-down shirt, short sleeves too, khaki pants, a strange hat, and most notably a feather tucked behind his ear. Just before he reached the entrance to the station, he made a sharp right turn and disappeared into the thick brush that separated the cemetery and the bike trail. It should be noted all the residential housing was behind us and could only be accessed by crossing through the work zone. It wouldn't be too out of place to see people use the trail that late, but it was 48 degrees outside and there was no path in the brush for the old man to traverse through. We grew concerned when no one saw him exit the woods. We thought that he went in to go around the construction equipment. Everybody saw him go in, but no trace of the man was ever found. Not even broken twigs or crushed leaves from where they first entered. To add to this mystery, the only thing on that side of the brush was a tall stone wall for the cemetery. We continued on with the night, but the oddity was not forgotten. Please share some real scary ghost stories that happened to you. We lived in a big house that was located in the Blue Ridge Mountains. We grew up there, and nothing ever happened. But when we went to my grandma's house, that was just down the road, the creepiest things would happen to my sister. She would say at night after we all fell asleep that she would be woken up by a slap across the stomach. She thought it was me, came into my room to yell at me. When she came in, I was sound asleep and she freaked out, so I let her sleep in my room. Another time we were outside playing and it was getting dark. I said as we were cleaning up that I had to go inside to the bathroom and I would be back. She said okay. But when I got back, she was laying on the ground, screaming and crying. She said she saw me come out of the house and run right at her and then punch her in the face. Then she said I shook off around the corner of the house, and when she went after me, she saw something horrifying. She said it was a tall creature, probably about 7 feet in height and wearing a black robe. She said she saw it and froze in fear, and it kept looking at her, but all she could see was its glowing eyes from the darkness. Then she said it let out a horrible scream, and she blinked and it was gone. Then she collapsed on the ground, where I saw her. She told my grandma, but she acted like my sister was just playing. 2 days later, my grandma came flying up to our house at around 10:30 a.m. She came in screaming. She said that she was last night in the kitchen making brownies when she heard someone at the front door knocking. She said it was around 8, so she was a little scared, but she went to see who it is. There was no one there. She thought it was some kind of kid from down the road maybe, but she thought nothing of it. But then later in the kitchen, out of the corner of her eye, saw a little man walking from the living room up the stairs. She flipped out, but then she talked herself down, thinking it was just her seeing things. She said that she didn't go to bed until 3 in the morning, which isn't unusual for her, and she said it was around 10 in the morning when she felt the blanket being pulled off of her. She shot up and saw a little man at the foot of her bed smiling. So she ran out of the house and came straight to us. She now sold the house. Story number 5. My grandfather's house. It was always a tradition in my family to go to my grandfather's house every Sunday for lunch. It was a tradition that had happened since before me and my older sister were even born. The house had always given me a pretty weird vibe since I was around 7. Yet for some reason I felt attached to the house more than I did my own. It's not unusual to feel like a place that you go to a lot is like a second home, but it felt more than that. I know that it sounds fake and it's up to you whether you want to believe me or not, but I would get a physical pain in my chest whenever we would have to leave. It was as if something was trying to keep me there. My grandfather passed away in early 2020 due to a mountain of health complications. Me and my family moved into his house to keep it in the family. I got my uncle's old room. My parents got the spare room, the biggest room in the house, and my sister got my grandfather's room, which is going to be important later. By this time, the pain I would get in my chest stopped, and although I probably should have told someone, I was a kid at the time and I was having these pains, so I didn't know that it couldn't have just been something serious. Everything was going fine for the first 3 weeks or so. We got settled in, and life continued as normal. That was until my sister started getting scratches down her leg while she would sleep. They were long and went from around her thigh to her knee. She still has scars from them too. There were some nights that she would wake up with what looked like burns on her arms. I thought for a long time that this was a ploy to scare me. Although looking back, I highly doubt that she would burn and scratch herself for a little joke. I would start to see shadows in the corner of my eye, but because I loved horror movies so much, I chalked it up to my imagination. My sister moved out when she was 18. I got her old room. After around 2 weeks of being in that room, I started to fully experience what my sister was talking about. I got long scratches down my legs and my chest. We have a dog, but she sleeps in my parents' room. This was not the experience that truly instilled my belief in spirits, though. I started to hear things coming from my attic. It was more than the occasional noise. Every single night, I could just sit here and hear what sounded like harsh footsteps and scurrying constantly. I originally had the same thought that a lot of people are probably thinking. It's some sort of rodent. So my parents did the natural thing called the exterminator. However, when the exterminator came and looked in the attic, there was no rodents and no traces that a rodent had ever been there in the first place. Raised by the dead. My mom's house was haunted growing up. First experience that she had was a shadow figure in the attic window who had appeared to be in a rocking chair. She had the feeling someone was staring at her and immediately thought, okay, I won't be the only one living here. We'd have dogs bark at random corners of the house. Every dog we ever had would refuse to go into the basement, where my bedroom was. Doors would slam shut, gusts of wind, shadows in our peripheral. Hearing footsteps on the old creaky floors numerous times in the middle of the night. Usually during a thunderstorm. We'd hear the front door slam too, and footsteps. This was outside my mom's bedroom door. My mom would experience a figure of a lady with frizzy hair standing at the end of her bed, where there's a window, so it's easier to make out her shape. A few times she felt it sit on the end of her bed. The mattress lowered, and she saw the figure in a sitting position, staring at her. As a kid, I couldn't explain what I was experiencing. I'd always have to run to my room through the basement. Always felt like something was right behind me. The craziest part is, when I told my mom I was moving out for the first time, activity increased tenfold. My girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife and mother of our 2 kids, didn't at this time believe in the paranormal at all, until she had an extremely stressful 6 months. Panic attacks weighed on her shoulders, bad dreams, would need to pull over numerous times to step out for fresh air. Then we were at a party at my mom's neighbor's house. This lady approached me and asked me if my partner was okay. I said she's just tired. Then she said she was a medium and asked if it was okay if she went and spoke with her. Apparently the spirit in my mom's house was trapped there. She killed herself by hanging in the attic during World War II. When she learned the news of her husband's death in battle, so my mom always said it was her first sighting was when it was in a rocking chair, but really was just her hanging. He was drafted, and then they bought his family house and planned to start a family. Thing that freaked me out the most is the medium said that I see her right now in your kitchen window. The medium was able to tell me details of my house, the exact burnt orange color of our basement floor, a sticker on my bedroom door. She's watching over your girlfriend to make sure she's the right one. This spirit is playing a motherly role in your life because all she wanted in life was to have kids of her own. Try to let her understand everything is okay. She's the right one for you, and to let her know she's dead and needs to move on. We did exactly that. We have another friend who is also a medium. My girlfriend went and spoke with her about all of this for her opinion. She confirmed everything, said that the lady's in the room with us right now, standing right behind her. So she was able to attach herself to her and attempt to torment her life. Our friend said her name was Mary, which is wild because as a kid I told my mom that's what the ghost's name was. No idea how I knew. We looked up our home in the city archives at the library to make, and well, I guess you could just say sure enough, Mary lived and died there in the 40s. I think we successfully guided her out of our world because my mom says the house is now quiet. She's not around anymore. Story number 7. The time the hospital elevator sent me to the basement. This is probably 11 years ago now. My mom was in the hospital. Can't remember why now, but she was there a few days. I went to go visit her, and she was like on the 5th floor, and I hate elevators, but I had to take it because I only knew how to get to her room by the elevator. This hospital was usually packed, but when the elevator doors opened, no one was inside and no one joined me. I stepped in, pressed the 5th floor button, and nothing happened. Frustrated, I pressed it repeatedly, and still nothing was happening. I got an eerie feeling, and I was about to get off when things shifted and the doors began to close. I pressed the 5th floor button again, but to my horror, the elevator started going down. My heart was beating like crazy. It just went down until finally it stopped and the doors opened. I knew I had to be in the basement because the floor it took me to was super quiet and dark. There was only a small light down there. I quickly began furiously pushing the 5th floor button, but nothing was happening. I had no idea where I was, but knew I was going to need help because the elevator wasn't working. As apprehensive as I was, I peeked out of the elevator and almost screamed when I saw a man standing by the corner near some janitorial supplies. I froze. I don't even remember if he spoke to me, but I know he said something. Maybe like, "It brought you down here?" He was very nonchalant. I just nodded and stepped out. I think because he told me there was another elevator I could take. The one I was in was not closing or going back up, so I stepped out, and indeed, there was another elevator beside the one I was just in. I pushed the button, and the second those doors opened, I flew in and pressed the 5th floor. I didn't see that man anymore. I figured he left, and I was glad. The elevator went up, and when I was finally at the 5th floor, I let out a big sigh of relief. I was so nervous as I made my way to my mom's room, and I was so happy when she told me they'd be releasing her that day. Story number 8. And if you guys are still up, don't forget to leave a comment and maybe a like. It helps us keep this channel going. And yes, my neighbor's kid is screaming outside. Not part of the horror part. Story number 8. Date appeared on my mirror. Hi, this actually happened to me back in 2016, but it's really creeped me out since it's happened. I have one of those over-the-door mirrors. Nothing special about it. My boyfriend bought it from Kohl's. Anyways, when I moved the door to access my closet, I noticed something was written on my mirror, only because the sun happened to hit it in just that right spot. I looked over the mirror and noticed the date was October 3rd. I get so nervous just remembering it. The handwriting was clearly not my own, and why the hell would I write something on my mirror? To clarify, this wasn't written in pen. It was like if somebody had written it with their fingernail. The only other person living with me was my boyfriend, so I asked him if he did it. He said the same thing. Why would I write on your mirror? Occasionally, my little sister would come to visit, but she is way too little to reach the spot where that date was written, and she could definitely not spell like that. So this date just randomly appeared on my mirror. I don't know how long it had been there. I'd also owned this mirror for about 2 years then, and had cleaned it several times. I cleaned the mirror after discovering it, but I honestly was terrified at how it got there, since I dread that day was October 3rd. I often even call into the work that day. It's never happened again. Keep hearing crazy metal banging after hearing my neighbor's kid scream. Listening. Well, that's just odd, guys. I guess no noise is good noise. Story number 9. The Banshee. My father passed away about 2 years ago now, and I had flown out to the Pacific Northwest to be at his deathbed, along with the rest of my family. So I was the last one to arrive, and we began a 2-day-long vigil of sorts. He had been out pretty much all of it for days, with the morphine and all that. But when I got there, he had become totally lucid for about 5 minutes, remarking on my haircut and other totally mundane things. My family was astounded. It was the first time lucidity he'd had in weeks. Anyway, so I went upstairs to get some sleep around midnight, just lying on top of one of those beds with the door open, clothes still on. I was startled from a semi-sleep at 2:30 a.m. by the most horrendous scream I've ever heard in my life. I about fell down, leaping out of bed, and ran down the stairs to find nothing at all. My dad's bed was in the family room next to the big double doors looking out of the Cascade Mountain range. He was asleep, and pretty out of it. My sister was sound asleep in the chair next to him, and my brother and his wife were in the bedroom adjacent to the living room, again, sound asleep. My mom was asleep on the couch next to his bed. Imagine the sound of a screaming woman, but sped up. It was like a 5-second long sustained scream or screech that cut off at the end, like someone played a recording of a scream but left out the beginning and the end. It was long enough that it woke me up, and I was standing when it ended. Weird. So it was not a dream by any means. My first thought was that Dad was gone and my sister was screaming. What is with everybody tonight? Gecko, neighbors? My first thought is that my dad was gone and my sister was screaming. She's not like that, but it's all I could think of. He passed away peacefully 6 hours later, all of us by his side. So I haven't said anything to anybody except my wife. It wasn't until months later that I was reading an article about the Banshee and I instantly knew that's what it was. My family's Irish, and from what I've read, it can run in families. One of my cousins had a similar experience back in the 70s. Forgotten about that. Story number 10. Al, you're dead. Go back to Georgia. When I was 6 months old, my family moved to Malmstrom, AFB, in Great Falls. This is in Montana. My dad was in the Air Force at the time. His job was security police, which means that he guarded the missile fields. It usually meant that he spent multiple days at a time in the field, important for later. The way housing works in the military is one family out, the next family in. The departing family is responsible for top-to-bottom cleaning of the house. A lot of times, the incoming family can go and take a look at the house to see if they want to accept it. Within a few days of arriving there, we were offered a house. My mother, who was a SAHM, don't know what that stands for, went to look at the house. She met Debbie, who was a current resident of the house. The house wasn't even close to being ready to pass final inspection, so my mom helped her clean so it would pass. After they had finished cleaning, my mom and Debbie were saying that all their goodbyes and all that good stuff. And all that when Debbie abruptly says to my mom, "You're going to hear a lot of stuff. So here's what happened. I killed my husband." Debbie's husband, Al, was having an affair. Al was telling his girlfriend that he and Debbie were divorcing, and he wasn't telling Debbie shit. Well, somehow they got together and confronted Al out of their house. They made him choose, and he chose the girlfriend. Al and the girlfriend then proceeded to leave. Debbie, overcome with emotion, grabs a knife, goes up to Al and spikes him once in the shoulder, right as he's about to get into his car. She immediately drops the knife and apologizes and tries to help him. Al runs. Al ends up pumping out all the blood of his system and loses consciousness as someone's porch really just lays there, eventually dies from massive blood loss. Debbie is charged, but ends up only getting like 7 years probation in her home state of Georgia. The wound would have only required stitches if he hadn't have run. It was a crime of passion, and even the girlfriend testified that she tried to help and was immediately remorseful. So, we moved in. Now, I was too little to remember fuck all, but so all this is my mother's telling. Immediately after we move in, weird stuff starts to happen. My mother was a smoker at the time and made a little corner in the basement where she would smoke cigarettes and read books. Sometimes the light would just click off. So, she would just turn it back on at first. After it kept happening, she had civil engineering come out and check the wiring. They ended up coming out 3 different times, never finding anything wrong. Eventually, my mom would just ask for Al to turn the light back on, and he would. Sometimes, one day, while down there smoking, the light went off, and when my mom asked to turn the light on, Al proceeded to flash SOS in Morse code. That was the last time my mom smoked in the basement. I forgot this bit, but sometimes it would feel like someone was caressing her cheek while she was reading. The floor plan of the house was basically cut right in half. Going in the front door, the kitchen, dining room, living room were all on the left of that order. About halfway into the house on the right was the door to the hallway that had all the bedrooms and the bathroom at the end of the hallway. My mom spent a lot of nights alone because of my dad's job. After she put us down for the night, she would close the door to the hallway and watch TV. On a pretty regular basis, the doors to the hallway would just open while my mom was watching TV. At first, she thought it could be my older sister that was around 4 at the time. But when she'd check, my sister would be soundly sleeping. The only other major incident that happened was one night it looked like smoke was coming up from behind the TV. It took the shape of a man's face. When my mom got up to take a closer look at the TV, the smoke immediately dissipated. The next day, she told her neighbor what she saw, and the neighbor freaked out because my mom had just described Al perfectly. One day, my mom was watching some show about the supernatural, and on this show, they were discussing how when people, especially men, freeze or bleed to death, they don't realize that they're dead, because you just lose consciousness and die. They also said that if you're being troubled by such a spirit, that you should address them by their name, remind them that they're dead, and tell them to go wherever they are for resting. From that point on, whenever Al did any of his ghostly shit, my mom would say, "Al, you're dead, go back to Georgia." This happened so often it became a routine for her. One night my mom had some friends over to hang out. Al pops the hallway door open. Instinctively, my mom says, "Al, you're dead, go back to Georgia." Everyone in the room just looks at my mom like crazy. She then has to explain the whole thing, and for the rest of the night, she had to escort anybody down the hallway that had to use the bathroom. However, that was the final appearance of Al. He finally realized he had died and found his peace. Story number 11. What the fuck were those hooded figures I saw as a kid? When I was a kid, about 7 years old, I saw these 3 hooded figures on 2 separate occasions, and I still wonder to this day what the I witnessed. Curious to know if anybody else has seen or heard of anything like this. So the first time it happened was at nighttime. I had not long gone to bed, and I was just laying there quietly waiting to fall asleep. I used to be quite scared of the dark when I was at that age, and I'd already had a few paranormal experiences by then, so my parents would leave the hallway light on for me and my door open just a few inches. The way my bed was positioned against the wall meant that I could see down past my feet, through the doorway, and down the hallway. All of a sudden, I saw 3 hooded figures coming down the hallway in single file towards me, and then turning left into my parents' room. The third one stopped for a moment and looked into my room straight at me, and that was when I screamed for my mom. The second time it happened was a few months later, and during the daytime. I was just chilling in my room alone playing with my toys when something caught my eye in my parents' room. I turned to look and saw the 3 figures walking in single file again. Both times I only saw them for a few seconds. Of course, I was scared, because that's not normal, but I didn't feel threatened by them. They were quite small, maybe 5 foot or so, and they looked quite like monks. Well, the clothes did anyways. I couldn't see their faces as it was just blackness. They moved in the same way monks walk, like slow and deliberate paces, with heads down kind of thing, you know? My dad was fighting with the council at the time to stop them cutting down the lovely big oak trees in front of our house, and he thought that that might be spirits connected to the trees in some way. I don't know what or who they were, but it was very strange, and I can remember it so vividly, 30 plus years later. Story number 12. Shit, she saw me. When I was 12, I went to stay at my grandma's house for the night, as we were going to the desert hot springs in the morning. Well, that night I could not sleep. I was sleeping in my grandma's bed. I couldn't stop getting out of bed, lying on the floor listening to my MP3 player. Yay, 2008. When I finally decided to lay down next to her and settle down, it happened. I looked down at the foot of the bed. There was a silhouette of a head looking at me. like somebody was knelt down. When I looked at it, it ducked down, as if it didn't mean for me to see it. I freaked out. I turned towards my grandma, and I heard the sound of someone crawling on the floor. The carpet in my grandma's house was weird. It made a very distinct crunching sound as you walked on it. Well, I heard someone crawling on the floor, around the side of the bed, over to my side of the bed. That was the first and only time I'd ever understood what paralyzed from fear meant. I broke out in the worst sweat. I swear to God, I felt someone standing over me. I heard the breathing. This lasted for about a minute, and when I was brave enough, I turned and of course, nobody was there. Funny thing I didn't realize until I started writing this is I knew from the second I saw a head looking at me that this was a paranormal experience. I saw a head, I heard someone crawling on the floor, and I felt someone standing over me. Maybe I'm stupid, but this easily could have been an intruder. But the entire experience and every day since, I knew it was a spirit. Not the first encounter I've had with one. I never heard footsteps walk away from me, and believe me, I would have. The presence I felt gradually subsided. I was scared, but I thank God I knew immediately what it was. I don't know what I'd have done if I thought it wasn't an actual person who was breaking in. I really wish I knew who that was looking at me. To this day, freaks me out. Even typing this. I had to get on my bed because I got scared of something coming out from underneath it. Story number 13. I experienced something, and I don't know where to go about this. I'm terrified to go back. I work in healthcare and take care of people inside their homes. My individual went to bed, so I was just relaxing on the couch at his house while my coworker was in a different room talking to his girlfriend. As I'm laying on this couch, I see something out of the corner of my eye. A pair of legs. I don't think anything of it. I just assumed my coworker thought I was asleep and was trying to sneak up just to mess with me. Everything was good until I saw a second pair, and then I started to freak out because there's only 3 people in the house, and my individual was asleep in the room in the front of me. When I looked up, I saw an elderly woman. I saw her pure as day. Crystal clear. I could make out every feature on her as she started walking to my individual's bedroom. I was terrified as an elderly woman has died in this house before, and other staff have talked about seeing a woman or a shadowy figure in the house. It's very common, apparently. When she got close to my person's bedroom where he was resting, I looked to see an elderly man. He was running, but his legs were walking. That makes sense. He was way faster than his legs were moving. I can't really explain it. They both disappeared into my person's bedroom, and right as they happened to be next to the door, it creaked open. I was paralyzed with fear. I could feel something just staring at me or reaching out for me. I could just feel its energy. I felt so unsafe and had an overwhelming sense of dread. I yelled out for my coworker and he ran in, and the door beside me closed, and he witnessed it too. For the rest of the night, nothing too big happened besides for shadowy figures and stuff moving. It's very common for small things like this to happen around that house. But I'm coming here because I've been freaking out ever since. No one believes me, and I swear on my mom I saw this old couple as pure as day. I can't comprehend it. I feel like they're following me too. I just feel so unsafe at all times now. Does anybody know what I should do, or does anybody even believe me? Story number 14. The Man, the Dog, and the Boy. So a little backstory. My wife and I were youth leaders at a church that had been, well, I guess you could just say it had a recreation building attached. When you walked into the building, it was a gymnasium, and at the back was a hallway that led to the bathrooms and a set of stairs that went up to the second floor. My wife and I would have Nerf wars with some of the youth and her siblings occasionally. We played one game, which was hide and seek in the dark with Nerf guns. Nice. I have 3 encounters to share. The first time I was hiding down the hallway next to one of the bathrooms, and I was facing the stairs. A little bit of light was coming through a window upstairs, but otherwise it was dark. As I was sitting there, I saw a 6-foot-tall person, who I thought was my friend, just looking out of the bathroom at me. I didn't think too much of it until I heard his voice out in the gymnasium. The other times was on the same day. Again, I was hiding down the hallway because everybody else was spooked because of what happened last time. Well, I saw my wife, her siblings, and another friend come down the stairs and go into the gymnasium. Right behind them came a dog. Only problem was there wasn't a dog in the building. It looked like a sick and tired greyhound. It looked out into the gymnasium and everybody else and then looked at me. Right after it did, it disappeared and everything went black and cold. I could still hear, but I couldn't see. I tried to stay calm, but eventually got to where I could see the light from the window. Later, as I was still recovering from what had happened and still hiding in the hallway, I heard a knock on the wall. And then a kid appeared half in and half out of the wall. He looked at me, and then it went dark. At the same time, my wife screamed, and I noped out of there in the direction I thought the light switch was. My wife told me later that she heard the knock and went to investigate because she thought it was me. When she went over there, she heard a growl from the wall. Needless to say, that was the last time we played Nerf there. Story number 15. Strange nighttime occurrence from my childhood. One night when I was around 7 years of age, roughly, I was just drifting off to sleep when I suddenly landed on my bed. And I mean landed as if I'd been hovering over it and was suddenly dropped like a sprint call. I looked around the room and found no one. My first thought was that it was just Jeff playing a prank. Jeff being a quirky friend of the family who was staying over that night. So I left my room to confront him. In retrospect, lifting a sleeping or almost a sleeping child and dropping him was really never one of Jeff's styles, you could say, but he was the most likely suspect that I had in mind. He was on the couch watching television with my parents and had no idea what I was even talking about. My parents vouched for him, stating that he had been there with them the entire time. I went back to bed, a little bit more than confused. Soon, this became a semi-regular occurrence and would happen sporadically throughout the remainder of my childhood, even continuing well into my teens, maybe even early adulthood, though I can't say for sure. Now, it does seem like being dropped onto your bed when you weren't even aware of not having been in it would be a traumatic experience, especially if it was reoccurring over the course of several years, but after the initial moment of being startled, it would leave a little impression, other than mild curiosity, or sometimes mild irritation. I did try to stay fully awake some nights, in the hopes of catching the event from the beginning and maybe seeing what it was that was lifting me. But it always occurred when I was half asleep and not aware of my surroundings. This never seemed to occur when I was fully asleep, but always in the nightlight realm, between conscious and unconscious. I don't know how I know that. I think it was just the feeling I would have afterwards, the feeling of almost having been asleep, that it never happened when I was awake enough to fully perceive what had happened. The closest I got was becoming fully awake just before the moment of impact. I know, Gecko. And actually seeing my pillow coming up at me. But that was the closest I ever came. The drops would happen the same way, pretty consistently the same way, with little variation. The only thing that would sometimes change would be the elevation. Sometimes I would hit the bed with a light impact as if I'd only been dropped from a few inches. And sometimes with a much heavier impact as if I had almost been lifted to the ceiling before my descent. The latter being the more annoying ones because it gave me the same jarring feeling that you get when you're in a hammock that suddenly collapses, where you feel as if your bones had separated themselves from your flesh so that your skeleton is loose inside your body. That's the feeling I get anyways. And it's not the one that I'm particularly fond of. Even then, I was never really scared, just a slight nuisance. It might also be worth mentioning that it wasn't just those two extremes. Often, in fact, maybe most of the time, it would be somewhere in between. Thinking back, I don't know why this didn't scare me. One reason might be that I always dropped on the center of my bed as opposed to on the floor or where I would hit the headboard. So it seemed safe enough. I simply knew it as that weird thing that sometimes happened. My parents were never concerned about it either. To them, it was just that weird thing that happened that Matthew sometimes mentions having happened. The one thing I've heard, writer, the narrator's opinion here, randomly, I don't know why I'm saying it, but I feel compelled to. Your body has like a sort of natural response when it thinks it's dying, or if your heart's stopping in order to jolt yourself, or rather stop yourself from having that happen. So, if you're ever laying flat and all of a sudden you're about to fall asleep and you just grab the bed all of a sudden because you're like, whoa, and you think that you fell or you have this sensation of falling, it's usually this autonomic response that your body gives in order to stop yourself from quote-unquote dying, except obviously you're not dying. Just my 4th cents on that. Story number 16. Okay, it's time I talk about stuff. Something has been following me my whole life. I'm not going to go into introspection or any sort of personal theory. I'm just going to give some short stories of events that have happened in my life leading up to this morning. I never really thought of these events as connected in any way, but my girlfriend, who's a spiritualist and a medium, has been drawing some concerning lines between the events. 4 to 6 years old, unsure of the exact age. My oldest brother, a male 20, took my siblings, myself, and a couple neighborhood friends, ages 5 to 13, on a trip to the woods behind our neighborhood. My oldest brother came upon a large dead stump of a tree, looked in it, and then kicked it over. Something I've only seen in video games and movies happened. Hundreds, or possibly even thousands of mice poured out of the broken stump covering the floor of the woods. Everyone else freaked out but me. I picked up one of the mice. I have no memories of that day after that event, and I have no idea what happened to that mouse. 10 years old. One night, I was very, very sick, possibly food poisoning, and I was in so much pain that I said out loud so many times that I would sell my soul for this to stop. I didn't get sick that night, and maybe a few days later, I woke up and saw the shadow of a man on the wall opposite my bed. I blinked, and he was gone. Around this time, I started drawing a strange symbol that I've always adopted as my own. I had never seen the symbol before, and even now I can't find the exact symbol like it anywhere. It's close to some Celtic symbols, or Celtic if you want to pronounce it that way, but with a symmetrical cross going through the center. 13-year-old. Now we get to the really weird stuff. Let me preface this by saying that I have high-functioning ASD. Nowadays, in my normal adult life, you wouldn't be able to tell unless you spent a whole week with me and studied my behaviors. That's not how it used to be. I used to be a complete disruption in the classroom. I had in the best words I can describe, coming to consciousness in the middle of gym class. I was freaking out about something, and then all of a sudden, it's like I just woke up and stopped being crazy. I never felt the same after that day. It's like my autism dialed down to the absolute minimum, and I could actually perceive things that I previously couldn't. 13 years old. I was hunting with a blowgun in my dad's backyard for birds. I shot one out of the air, and it straight up disappeared. My friend and I went looking for it for about half an hour, and then when we walked back to my dad's back porch, it was lying on the ground right on the front step. High school. I'm not going to go into every little detail and small event, but what I can say throughout high school is I felt like I was doing something to people. Every person who I felt wronged me or got some sort of cosmic punishment that I felt I was responsible for. A while ago, I made a post about how all of my school bullies have horrible lives. I can't stress that enough, how horrible their lives are. People that I was close to that wronged me ended up in mental institutions. Meanwhile, it felt like I was untouchable, felt like I could absolutely not get into trouble. 21 to 25 years old. I had a string of paranormal encounters at the job I worked at. Also, in another post of mine and a YouTube, I made a video with these stories. Those ones are scary-ish. Currently, I'm 27. My girlfriend moved in a few months ago, and she's a medium. She was immediately aware of something. A mirror has fallen from the wall. A stack of Yu-Gi-Oh cards fell from the counter to the ground in front of me. We've heard knocking, and this morning I found a fingernail mark on my shoulder. Here's the spooky thing. I've been biting my nails, pretty much to the nub since I was 5. My girlfriend sleeps facing away from me, and I was wearing a shirt that covers that area, and the mark location and angle indicates somebody grabbing my shoulder from behind. It was much taller than me. I'm 6'3" and sleep on my back. Story number 17. Is this kid seeing a ghost? I, a 25-year-old male, work in a small town and work at the daycare center. Today, when a kid 4 years old was dropped off, their mother turned to me and asked me, "Who's Christopher?" And taken a bit back, I turned to her and asked what she was even talking about. It was only the normal kids that come here, and with it being a small town, I knew that she knew every kid there. She looked at me and said that her child said there was somebody new here named Christopher. I told her no. We both laughed it off, and she left. Later on, I asked the kid who Christopher was. They got really bashful and shy-like and said that he was a boy here. That was really shy as well, and wasn't shy around them, and that he was only here when I wasn't. Now, I understand that kids can be kids and could be seeing imaginary friends, but the part that I get concerned by is that he's only here when I'm not. I'm not saying it's a ghost, but I'm also well aware of the fact younger children can see things adults can't. And I'm not trying to be egotistical or anything, but I'm a practicing pagan and have spent a lot of energy protecting myself from bad spiritual stuff. Essentially, so I do find it concerning that something that only wants to communicate with the child doesn't want to be here when I'm not. So I ask, do you think this is a ghost or just a child being a child and having imaginary friends? Story number 18. More spooky shit at daycare. It's been a bit since all that happened. Never got around to talking to the other kids about if they had also seen Christopher as well. But the idea that the building is haunted hasn't left my mind. and that thought is even more prevalent after today. So the usual routine for the kids is just snack in the morning, play until lunch, have lunch, and then put the kids down for nap time. Today I took my lunch an hour later than I usually do, which I do usually just before the kids go for the nap. But this time it meant that I was there to put the kids down for nap, and I left after most of them had gone to sleep. When I got back, there was a few kids awake with the other worker there. After a while, we got the few kids that were awake to start coloring. And where we had them coloring, you could clearly see the door to the room in which the rest of the kids were napping. On this day, we had 8 kids, which is about the usual for us seeing how it's small. At the time, we had 4 kids awake and 4 still napping. While drawing, well, I was facing the door, so I could see when a kid comes out after waking up. After a while, I saw the door open. Not fully open, but come off the latch. So I got up to go see what kid it was. When I walked around to see, I could see a child's face peering through the small crack in the door. But almost as soon as I saw this, the door closed quickly. I laughed it off as just one of the kids messing around and went to go check which kid it was. When I went to open the door, it felt as if the doorknob was being held on the other side. But it was just the slightest feeling, so I didn't require any more effort than it was, if it was typical. But it still had that feeling attached. When I opened the door, I expected to see one of the kids standing behind the door because of that feeling that I did have. But when I peered into the room, every kid in there was still sleeping. I don't know whose face I saw in the door. Not because it wasn't one of the kids, but when I think back on it, I feel like the face was almost barren. Like there wasn't an actual look to it, but the way the door closed almost as soon as I had made eye contact with it is still kind of terrifying.